You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Well, John, without further ado, let's bring on our first guest of the program today. I want to welcome back Michaela Dodge, who's with the Heritage Foundation, and she is Policy Analyst, Defense and Strategic Policy Studies with the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. Michaela, it's great to have you back on the program with myself and John.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, it's been sort of an interesting, I guess, the last few days. We're seeing reports coming out from the South Koreans that North Korea has had, they believe, 6 short-range missile tests, which wouldn't be unordinary for them to be testing, but it seems that they're trying to figure out if they're testing something new or if they're just trying to provoke the United States and South Korea or possibly get us back to the diplomatic table.
I think that we never actually left the diplomatic table. It was North Koreans who were threatening nuclear annihilation just a couple months ago. It was the North Koreans who tested a nuclear weapon device in February and a long-range ballistic missile in December. So we've tried to increase our defenses, increase our alert levels in the region, and we'll see where this crisis goes and what is it that they're trying to accomplish with the most recent launches.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. So when we look at North Korea, I mean, I know that we've, in negotiations with North Korea, passed agreements for them to halt or refrain from advancing their nuclear program. We've provided a lot of different aids, usually with regards to food and sometimes energy, or working with China with energy or things of that nature. What do you think is the appropriate action or step for the United States to be taking?
I think that it is very important that we continue to boost our defenses, both homeland and in South Korea, and in protecting our troops in Japan and in South Korea. That we provide tools for our allies that make them feel assured that we revitalize our nuclear weapons deterrent to be able to threaten what North Koreans value. I see little potential for dialogue for now. The North Koreans are threatening with a nuclear attack. They keep behaving belligerent, and we don't even know what is their structure of decision-making and who actually has the power, who could negotiate in good faith, who has the trust of leaders. It's a very complex and very difficult situation.
No, I agree. But before I think this is very important. You actually just recently wrote a few things on missile defense, and I want to touch on that a little bit because I think as we can't prevent all nations from obtaining advanced weapons, but what we can do is stay ahead of the curve by having the best weapons defense systems. And I think you bring up a couple of great points in your article, so I'd like you to touch on that, if you will.
Absolutely. Defenses are incredibly essential and important in the current world that we face, which is a world where there are other nuclear powers than Russia and China. There are leaders that may not be rational in the same way that the United States is. There are leaders that don't value their populations but value their means of oppression and means of threat. Now, these things are much harder to destroy than just civilian populations. So what we're doing what we should be doing is modernizing our arsenals, both conventional and nuclear, and building up defenses in a way that does not make us try to catch up with the threat. Once we know that something is going to happen, we need to stay ahead of the curve.
Now, it's interesting to me. I guess our first real significant missile system were the ones that we deployed in the Gulf during the first Gulf War. I know they had been working on systems since, but that was the first time that we really had deployed them on a large scale and for trying to protect or defend population or populated areas. And I think we've learned quite a bit since then. But have we done all that we should be doing?
Well, in the Gulf War, what we deployed were the Patriot systems, and actually the first one was a prototype. It wasn't a ready-made system, and we developed it to make sure that the coalition survives and Israel doesn't get involved in the war. We've learned a lot. We've learned a great deal during the Strategic Defense Initiative program. We've utilized some of these technologies developed during the program in our current missile defense system. We haven't pursued comprehensive layered missile defense system that is the one that could defeat all the possible ballistic missile threats, including Russia, which I think has been a great mistake because it doesn't matter whether a missile was launched in Russia or China. There is no reason why you should not defend your populations from these threats. So I think that we need to do a better job of thinking through ballistic missile defenses, because the technology is here and we've seen it performed a great deal over the past 20 years.
Michaela, I want to direct this question in a way that would almost be comparable to business, right? So when you think about the discussion here, one of the most important things that comes to mind are two things. One is friends and foes. The other is weapon systems and the advantages that we may or may not hold in the future in same. So first, on the weapon systems themselves, one of the things that is very interesting and perhaps very powerful about being the country that spends the most on research and development on weapon systems is it offers us the potential to be the primary weapons supplier to the democratic or in some cases, as we know, they're not all democratic like the House of Saud, but at least to friends and allies. So if we're providing the weapons systems, we have the potential. Those weapon systems could have, especially in those countries, could have 30, 40 year lifespans. So it offers us not just the weapons systems advantages, but it offers us the political advantage of holding some power and influence over those. So I want to get your opinion on that concept, and then how you see the change in China becoming a rising potential world supplier, and how you see that playing out in the future.
With regard to the weapon system, you're right. It's one of the tools of influence. But what we're trying to achieve is make sure that the United States and its allies are not going to be in a fair fight. What you're trying to do is to fight with an advantage, and that is what our superior both training and weapon systems provide. Military exercises and joint military-to-military cooperation, when tailored properly, can be a great tool of state power. So that would be my take on the weapons question.
It's funny you say that, by the way. I've found it to be interesting at best, absolutely crazy and wrong-headed at worst. When you watch a lot of what goes on in the news, and you see some of these skirmishes, the press likes to make it sound like the guys who win are the bad guys, even when clearly when there's a fight against terrorists for whatever. Well, it was unfair fight because 127 of them died and only 2 of ours died, and somehow there's like a moral equivalency to the number of people who died on which side, as opposed to which side actually was right or wrong in the battle.
I think you're right. I originally come from Czechoslovakia, which has been under the Soviet influence for almost 4 decades, and I can tell you that U.S. influence in the world is nothing like the bad guys' influence in the world. They're not morally equivalent, and I think it's very important to remind Americans that they're a great force for good around the world. And behind these good policies and good actions are people, are citizens. They're real faces whose life can improve greatly because of U.S. presence.
It's funny. I had probably one of the just most difficult conversations I ever had in my life was with a young man who described how he and a group of friends finally escaped across Thailand, across Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia until they finally got to Thailand, and he was the only one to survive. And the slit throats next to you, why they left me and not my friend, and all these kind of things until the end. But when you hear somebody, and at the time we were maybe 19 or 20, and when you hear somebody tell something that you may see in a movie and they actually live through, it's so amazingly impactful that I think it's easy for us when we're in the comfort of our living room watching TV. We just don't really get what maybe you learned, when you were a child, that evil really does have a face, and it's not pretty.
I couldn't agree with you more. American people are very blessed to have the military that they have. They've been very blessed by having military superiority that they've had. It's very important that we continue that advantage, and it's very important to sustain the global order that has benefited the majority of the people than ever before in the history.
So I'm glad you used the word global order, because my next question for you is exactly on that subject. And it's, again, I'm going to frame it in a business sense. A business works very hard to grow its base of customers, get more value, deliver more value to those customers so they can increase revenue and try to not lose customers. One of the things that worries me greatly about what's happening in the changing geopolitical landscape now is that America is not only as good as our weapon systems. We're honestly and truly only as good as the trusted allies that we have for decades, predictable, reliable, long-term strategic alignments. And the risk here is when we look at things like what North Korea and Russia and China as well, but particularly North Korea and Iran are doing, we have to look at the president and our allies and say, are we doing a good job of using that tactically to increase those who think like us and want to align with us for their own safety and make that potentially long-term alignments, or is the other side somehow winning because we're looking weaker, and so to hedge their bet, they either go to the other side, or as some countries like India seem to be doing, playing a very neutral card game?
I think that both of these are not mutually exclusive, as sort of contradictory as it might seem. On one side, you have traditional alliances and great partnerships that have been developed for decades, and you would hope that even if the policy is bad for maybe few years, the relationship will be able to sustain it. Eventually, just like any relationship, if you don't work on it, you are going to lose it. And some of those losses could be just strategic and have significant impact on our interests around the world. And I think that might be the case with South Korea. It's the case definitely with Europe, where you have this really, really big country that has many interests that are contradictory to what the U.S. desires for the continent. So you want to make sure that you keep good eye on those relationships and nurture them and advance them. Because, again, implications for your interests around the world can be huge, and they're not going to be beneficial to your economy. They're not going to be beneficial to your troops on the ground.
That's a great point. We were discussing on the program last week, I call what happens around the world like a chess game. And I think, sometimes I feel our administration is playing checkers or some other type of game, but they really need to start, at least learning how to play the game. Because I think Russia has, or the Russian Federation, most likely Russia, it has made some very key moves in negotiations with this administration. For instance, they've gained the advantage in the START treaty, the pullback of missile defense in Europe. And I feel like the Russians right now, their involvement in Syria and some of the bombers or subs that they've been flying in and around our territory, I think they're making their voice known and heard, but we need to respond, I think, in getting them back to the table to negotiate some things that we need that are beneficial to our policy by pushing on some of these frontiers that really offend them, such as revisiting missile defense in Poland or some of the other European countries, possibly with Turkey. And I bring this up because in a news line right now I want to look at Syria real fast if we can. Syria, the Israelis supposedly, and of course they haven't confirmed this, but foreign media has, that there were attacks on shipments of missiles that were headed towards Hezbollah, and they were taken out. And of course, we see in the news cycle today, in the last day or so, that the Syrian Bashar Assad has said that they have missile systems are moving into place to strike Tel Aviv if, in fact, Israel launches another attack on Syrian forces. And I think it's important because I see, as Russia's supporting Syria, and so is Iran, I think Syria feels like, well, we've got them behind us, so we could make these kind of moves. But what is the voice of the United States as the counter voice?
Well, or its leading from behind voice that hasn't worked that great so far. The Russians insist on another regional wordless conference that is just going to prolong Assad's reign. There are few good options, but some of them are better and some of them are worse. Russia has not been helpful on any international issue that we've been dealing with. We gave up most of our advantages on both missile defense and strategic weapons in the flawed New START treaty that you mentioned. Russia retained just tremendous tactical nuclear weapon advantage in Europe to be able to continue to be intimidating to its neighbors. To come back to Syria, they really have not been helpful either. And it is good that Israel has the Iron Dome missile defense system, which is now being deployed around Tel Aviv to protect its populations. And hopefully it will be enough to protect to whatever might be coming from Syria, not only if Israel gets involved, because some of these weapons transfers are truly vital for Israel. Some of these transfers are just incredibly threatening to the very fabric of this, tiny country. They don't have the strategic depth that we have. So you raised many important issues, and I'm really grateful that you're doing it because they're very important.
Isn't it interesting too that when you look at the fact that these systems may be so important, it's not just the battle that's there. Part of the biggest reason why Israel has had stability is the exact reason why I believe the world has had stability in the last 50 years, because its local allies know that if they push too far, if they cross the line and really start dropping airliners or bombs over Tel Aviv, that their entire country may cease to function. And if they learn that they have a level of counter weapons that are of a big enough threat to Israel, that Israel loses that one-sided advantage, I believe the entire area is very likely to fall right back into the kind of chaos we saw in 67 and 73, and the ending will be much bloodier, I believe, and much worse.
Might as well be, with proliferation of more sophisticated ballistic missile technologies and more sophisticated weapons. We can also mention Syrian chemical weapons. There is a really great potential for damage, probably larger than at any point in the history in the past. Israel just doesn't have strategic depth to be able to afford to lead from behind. Few chemical weapons, few ballistic missiles armed with nuclear weapons, and that's it for Israel. The country will cease to exist. So it's very important that we provide our support, provide our diplomatic support, but also make sure that we exercise our influence in a way that does not further destabilize the situation. Be it in influencing Israeli actions, influencing other Middle Eastern countries in the region, in providing technologies that they give them more time to decide, to perhaps find all the facts and not exercise decisions or taking actions under pressure. all of these things are just vitally important.
Absolutely. Well, very well said. Michaela, I want to thank you for joining us today. First off, as you have every time you come on the show, you teach us more things, and you certainly teach our listeners in the final say. Michaela, can you please let our listeners know where they can learn more about Heritage and more about your efforts?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. You always ask wonderful questions. The listeners can go to Heritage's website, which is www.heritage.org. There is a search box on the upper right corner where you can search for any issues from whatever interests you on domestic side to foreign policy side.
Well, excellent. Thank you for joining us today on The Final Say. Michaela Dodge is a policy analyst in defense and strategic policy at the Heritage Foundation, a friend of the show, and always a great contributor. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Be well.